بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله وكفى وسلام على عباده الذين اصطفى أما بعد رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي سبحانك لا علم لنا إلا ما علمتنا إنك أنت العليم الحكيم. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, dear respected brothers, elders, fellow community members. So before we start, quick apology from last session, just because we did sort of go over just a tad bit slightly the allocated time. And obviously, if it's a lot of information to digest, then it might get a bit overwhelming. So really, there's a dual purpose behind maybe bombarding people with information. Maybe a bit of a double-edged sword. But what I want everybody to appreciate is the vast ocean of knowledge and information out there. And how we as Muslims, I mean, this is our history. We're Muslims. Doesn't matter where these people are from or the nationalities, we're Muslims, which means it's as important to us as maybe Indian history or Pakistani history or wherever we're from, even in British history. So it's just to show how much there is out there and how little we know. And for us to then, based on that, make an action plan. So our goal shouldn't be, I want to cram a whole library of information into my head. It should just be, look, I've got maybe 60, 70 years in this world. All I want to do is just go to Allah, return to Allah, and present a plan that I did make a plan and a roadmap to attend every single Jumu'ah talk and maybe whatever lecture or session was going in my local mosque, just so that there's that continual development, intellectual development. Because obviously when you plant a seed, it doesn't just grow into a tree the very next day. There's a continual, gradual, sometimes tedious process of watering it, nourishing it, and looking after it. Then at the end, you can boast to your friends about a massive tree that you have in your garden. So moving on to today's session, what I've planned to do is, and because these sessions are sort of experimental, I mean, I don't have a template to follow, so they might go from here to there. So if we can just bear with me on this rocky ride and we can reach the end, hopefully. So for today's session, I'm going to actually cut it into two segments. We've got 3 sections to cover. We're going to try and cover 1 and 2 today. The next week we've got the conference, and hopefully maybe the week after that we can reschedule and then complete the last section. So what we've noticed is, for the past 2 sessions, let's just do a quick trivia. I don't want to put people on the spot, but session number 1, who was our individual that we focused on in our discussion? Can anybody remember his name? Umar al-Mukhtar. And he was from which country? He was from Libya, okay. And I don't want Arshad Uncle to monopolize this, so I want, come on people, you can engage and interact as well. Second session, a few weeks ago, the long drawn out one, we talked about who? Who was our distinguished personality? Fakhri Pasha. And what was his, I mean, I'm not going to say nationality because it's a bit of a parochial, it's a bit of a restrictive term, but let's just, for argument's sake, what was his nationality? Where was he from? He wasn't exactly from Turkey. He was part of the Ottoman Empire. Where was he actually born? In Bulgaria. He was born in Bulgaria. So one thing that I want to highlight from this is the Ottoman Empire is not a Turkish empire. Let me just highlight that now. The Ottoman Empire is not Turkish. The actual designation of referring to the Ottomans as Turks was invented by the West, so that they can portray an image to the citizens of the Ottoman Empire and the people of the West that the Turks are authoritarians, that the Turks are in control of this autocratic state, meaning that they're in charge and they're the tyrants and they're the despots. And everybody who's not a Turk is by definition a subhuman and a sub-citizen, so they're automatically inferior. But that's the complete opposite to what the actual reality is. In the Ottoman Empire, just to go on a bit of a tangent, you had obviously the main head of state, who was the Sultan. You had the Sultan, and then after 1507, they became the Caliph as well, so Caliph and Sultan. And you also had a prime minister, who's known as a vizier or wazir in Arabic. There are roughly around 250 of these. Now, this is shocking to know that majority of these prime ministers of the Ottoman Empire and Ottoman dynasty were not Turkish, were not of a Turkic background. You had, imagine, you had some from Italy, you had some from Bulgaria, you had some from Romania, you had some from Greece. So they were from everywhere. So it was a very pluralist society here. And here we are in England, we're applauding Rishi Sunak as the first minority prime minister, where the Ottomans had already done it. And they were doing it for nearly 600, 700 years. So it's important to understand where you receive your narrative from. Because if you're getting it from the West, they're going to portray the Ottoman Empire, like we said, as a Turkish empire, but it wasn't. And I think Nigel Farage, a few years ago as well, when he was campaigning for whatever he was doing, and he had a poster, he sent out a poster as part of his propaganda campaign. on immigration and whatnot. And his caption said, "The Turks are coming." The Turks are coming, which was a reference to the Ottomans. The Ottomans genuinely proved as an existential threat to the West. The reason why, one of the reasons why the West today are superior and advanced in pretty much every single sphere except for morality and religion can be pinpointed to the Ottomans. If I tell you that, it might sound a bit wacky and bizarre. I mean, how did the West reach the superior position today? Because of the Ottomans. They were in a perpetual state of fear because of the Ottomans. The Ottomans are on our doorstep, and the Ottomans were slowly but surely taking land. What if I was to tell you that the furthest extent of the Ottomans in Europe was Vienna? They knocked at the gates of Vienna twice. It was a failed siege both times, but they were there in Vienna. We're talking about Austria here. And this was, the first siege was in 1529, 500 years ago. There was a threat, genuine threat, that the Ottomans might overrun Europe. So the Europeans doubled, tripled, and multiplied their efforts to modernize their military and their technological systems so that they could fight the Ottomans. If the Ottomans weren't there, then the Europeans wouldn't have reached the high almighty pedestal that they are today. So what we're going to do today is, Algeria is our backdrop. So we're going to talk about, and this is a bit of a challenge, what I'm going to try and do for you today is condense history of North Africa. And this is why it's a challenge. From 642 all the way up until 1830. Hopefully, I'm going to try and cap it at 20 minutes. I've set an alarm on my phone as well. A bit unconventional, but I mean, we don't want to overrun it. And the second part, the reason why I'm going to stop at 1830, does anybody know why I'm stopping at 1830? Something happened in 1830, which was seismic. French occupation, French colonial occupation in Algeria, which lasted all the way up until 1962, for 130 years. Yeah? And I'm going to focus on this as a template for colonialism. Colonialism meaning, just to define it very simply, where the West goes around to, well, not even the West, I mean, that's a relative term, where the Europeans make their way to the West, which is obviously America, before they settled there, and to the East, and maybe to the South as well, in a bid for, well, different reasons actually. We'll go into why they even made these ventures. And then, unfortunately, to spoil the party, people were wondering who we're going to talk about today. We're going to put that on hold. We're going to talk about him next session, because this is really important. Just like the last session. If there's anything you can remember from the last session, what was it? About World War I. The idea about World War I. World War I is as important to Muslims as it is to the Germans and the British and the French and the Americans. I mean, the Americans only came into the war towards the end. The Ottomans were in the war from the beginning. The Ottomans, we're talking about a Muslim caliphate here. And if you can remember, this is a fun fact, the last official call for jihad ever made was by the Ottomans to enter World War I. By the Shaykh al-Islam, Urup Lubey. So he issued actually 4 fatwa, 4 legal edicts, galvanizing the Muslim world into action against Britain and France. So it's important to understand where our place lies in modern history. And this is modern history, we're talking about 100 years into the past. Okay, so the celebrated warrior. Why have I even titled it like that? Let's just put that on hold and let's move into what we're going to talk about. So this is a quick crash course on North African history. Now, the thing is, North Africa is really on the periphery. So North Africa isn't near the heartlands of, let's say, Syria or Palestine or Saudi Arabia or even Anatolia, close to Turkey. It's far away. So sometimes people often neglect it. People think Muslim history is only a history of the Arabs. And to be fair, the North Africans, like we'll see later on, I mean, even though we say Morocco, Tunisia, Algeria, Egypt, they're Arab countries, they are Arabized countries, meaning they weren't always originally Arab. There was a different indigenous and local population living in North Africa, as we'll see now. So let's move on without further ado. There are a few terms I want us to be familiarized with first. Number one is Maghrib. We don't mean Maghrib Salah. I mean, Maghrib comes from the word Ghurub, which means the place of sunset, or sunset or the place of sunset. So because the sun sets in the west in Arabic is known as Al-Maghrib. So this is the west in terms of, if you're relatively looking at the west from Saudi Arabia. So anything on this side of Saudi Arabia is the west. So North Africa is known as Al-Maghrib. And this is a historical region, and it comprises of all of these countries. You've got Tunisia, Algeria, and Morocco. Libya is included in there as well. Then we've got another Arabic term called Ifriqiyya. Try and keep these terms in mind. And that's an Arabic term for Tunisia, or the modern region of Tunisia. Then we've got Jazair, which is Algeria today. And then finally, this is interesting, Berbers or Amazigh. Amazigh is the original term. And these are the people who are the indigenous population of North Africa, not the Arabs. So I don't know if you can remember, a few months ago we had a Jamaat who came from Belgium, and there was a scholar who studied, Maliki scholar, studied in Mauritania, and they were all from Morocco, so they were all brothers of each other. So when I was talking to them, then I asked them where they were from. They said, we're from Morocco, but we're Amazigh, meaning originally, so many, maybe even centuries down the line, they were once upon a time Berbers. So their origins are of this Berber Amazigh ethnicity. So what even are Berbers and where did they come from? Where did they go today? We'll talk about that later on. So very quickly, I mean, if we're talking about history, then we need to at least have a picture of geography in our minds. We need to at least have an idea of where countries are situated. And the reason why I want to go through this quick timeline is because you always need a bit of chronology in your mind. You always need to know, you need to have at least a bit of a skeleton as to what happened, when it happened, and who was involved. So here we've got North Africa. You can see there, Western Sahara, Morocco, Algeria, Libya, Egypt, Sudan, not really included in North Africa, but it's there just for reference purposes. Now we move in. That might be a bit of a loaded picture, but I want you to focus on the red circle. So in that picture, you've got a color-coded map of the Muslim empire in the 850s. And let's just put North Africa to a side now. Can we just appreciate the expanse of that empire? The Umayyads, first Muslim empire ever, they had a landmass, the largest landmass of any empire, which was nearly 12 million kilometers squared, stretching from really China, the southern tips of China, all the way up until Africa, North Africa, and then Spain as well. And if I was to tell you in 732, an army from Spain, a Muslim Spanish army under the control of the Umayyad governor in Cordoba. Cordoba was the center, was the capital of the Umayyads in Spain. They were knocking at the door of Poitiers in France. So people have speculated if they had won the battle, which they lost, then who knows what Britain and France might be today. Yeah, so that just shows how far and how deeply the Muslims penetrated into Europe. So North Africa first came under Muslim control, or the first times Muslim ever entered into North Africa, does anybody know? It was under the reign of Umar radiallahu anhu. And his commander was Amr ibn al-As radiallahu anhuma, and he was a very important companion, and he conquered Egypt. So he was in control of Egypt. This happened in 642. Yeah, so this is after the Prophet's demise by 10 years. The Prophet ﷺ passed away in 632. Just keep that as a reference point. 10 years later, the Muslims had already entered into Egypt. And Egypt at that time was under the control of which tyrannical empire? The Romans. The Romans meaning the Byzantines. The Byzantines were the eastern branch of the Romans. The Romans were based in Rome. They had already dissipated by then. The Byzantines were based in which capital city? In Turkey? Istanbul, previously known as Constantinople. Yeah, named after the Roman or the Eastern Roman Emperor Constantine. So 642, Amr ibn al-As has taken Egypt. And to be fair, things are put to a halt now. So expansion doesn't carry on into Libya and Algeria, Tunisia and Morocco. It stops there. They do conduct a few raids into the North African lands, but they didn't really intend on setting up a local indigenous government. That all changed with Muawiyah radiallahu anhu. Muawiyah radiallahu anhu was the first Umayyad caliph, and he really wanted to destroy and exterminate the Byzantine Empire because they were seen as a challenge to his authority. And the Byzantine Empire, now before they were in Syria, Muslims kicked them out. They were in Palestine, the Muslims kicked them out. They were in Lebanon, Muslims kicked them out. They were in Egypt, Muslims kicked them out. And now Muawiyah radiallahu anhu set his sights on North Africa. So he wanted to expel them from the North African region. And he sent one of the most legendary figures, and I mean we have to, at some time in the future, we have to carry out one dedicated lecture on him. His name was Uqba ibn Nafi'. Uqba ibn Nafi', and he was a legendary commander. So he was sent by Umar radiallahu anh, and he literally swept across. You can see there, all of those green lands. He swept across all of those lands, and he brought them under Muslim control. And he set up the first Arab administrative city in North Africa, which is in modern-day Tunisia, called the city of Qayrawan. the city of Qayrawan in Tunisia. And that was set up under the auspices of Muawiyah radiallahu anh. And along the way, now who did we say the indigenous people of North Africa were? The Berbers. So the Berbers, right? So Berber isn't actually a name given to them by themselves. It's not an endonym. An endonym is a name given from within. It's an exonym, a name given from outside. So Berber comes from the Greek word Berberoi. Before we even get to that, Berber, does it sound similar to any word in English? Barbarian. Yeah? Well done. So Barbaroi in Greek, I'm butchering the pronunciation, means a barbarian. Somebody who's uncivilized, somebody who's uncouth, somebody who's not sophisticated. And that just shows how the West has always seen everybody else. They're always inferior and below us. So the Romans and the Greeks, when they conquered North Africa, they saw these people as subhumans. They're not even worthy of being equated to our animals and our steeds. So let's just give them a name of Berbers. So they were known as Berbers. Now, when I was talking to those Belgian brothers from the Jamaat, then they really resented the name Berber. Because Amazigh is the name given to them by themselves. Amazigh literally means free people. North Africa is our land, we're free, we're not restrained by anyone. As soon as the Greeks and the Romans came, then they changed it to Berber. And then that's where we get the word barbarian in English. So the Berbers, they were oppressed by the Christians. The Christians, the Byzantine Christians. And Christianity, it's mind-boggling, has dozens is even an understatement, has hundreds of different splinter groups and aberrations and sects, more than any other religion. So the Byzantines subscribed to one version of Christianity. And obviously, as is the case with Christianity in the West, and this is also another point, Christianity is not indigenous to the West. Where did Christianity come from? It came from Jerusalem. That's not even in the West. It's in the East. So a religion which was so prevalent and popular in Europe, which was seen as a European possession. They were so protective over Christianity that they were willing to fight the people of the East for Christianity, didn't realize that Christianity came from the East. And Isa alayhi salam was an Oriental. He was somebody who came from the East. So anyway, the Byzantines were very intolerant. So if you don't conform to our idea, you might even be a Christian. If you don't follow our warped idea of Christianity, then we don't class you as a Christian. So now you're going to be subjected to torture and persecution and whatnot. So the Berbers were disenfranchised. They were disinterested with Byzantine rule. So now when the Muslims come along, and this is the main recurring theme whenever Muslims enter into a new land, Islam is all about justice. And with justice comes the Qur'an's own idea and definition of equality. We're not talking about the Western liberal idea of equality, where apparently everybody's born free. We'll talk about that later on. Everybody's born equal. That's a fallacy. Nobody's born equal. That may be in religious terms, but in the terms that they want us to believe everybody's born equal, it doesn't work. And it's completely baseless. So when the Muslims came, then Islam was appealing to the Berbers because they thought, one are Arabs, but this Islam, this new religion, still gives us certain rights and responsibilities and privileges that the Arabs also enjoy. So we're all now on an equal footing. We're now classed as brothers with these Arabs as well. And the Arabs, they were more, you could say, familiar to the Berbers than the Greeks. Why? Because the Berbers and the Arabs were both Bedouin people who roamed around the pasture lands, whilst the Greeks and the Romans were people of civilization in their urban cities. So they resonated a lot more with the Arabs. So when the Arabs came with Uqba ibn Nafi', then they started converting in droves, the Berber people. They were still tribal. Maybe you could say they were still a little uncivilized, but they saw Islam as liberating for them. So this will happen with Uqba ibn Nafi', and there's a really famous story of Uqba ibn Nafi' and how he was encouraged by the spirit of spreading Islam's unique version of justice. So he was at the tip of North Africa, and he was overlooking the Mediterranean Sea, and he was there with his stallion, and he remarked to himself, and he was talking to Allah here. He said, "Oh Allah, if only my horse could trample upon water, then I would traverse this Mediterranean Sea just to spread your religion." So that was the kind of idea that encouraged and pushed and supported these people throughout their conquests and their campaigns. So now Uqba ibn Nafi' takes all of these lands, and things are now consolidated for the Muslims. The Byzantines still have a few outposts in North Africa. So they haven't been fully evicted, they're still there. This all changes now in 698. So we're talking about a few years, maybe a decade, 2 decades into the future now. So some of Uqba ibn Nafi''s successors and the governors, they carry on, they resume the campaigns against the Byzantines, and to be fair, there were a few problems with the Berber people. The Berbers, the Umayyads, as we'll maybe talk about later on, even though the Umayyads were Muslims, they sort of had an idea of Arab pride, an Arab nationalism, if you want to call it that. So the Umayyads, even though they were Muslims, this is why we make a distinction between the religion and the adherents. The religion is all about equality, Allah's own idea of equality, which is the best, optimal idea of equality. And then you've got the equality that sometimes the Muslims might employ and execute, which in the case of the Umayyads was deficient. So if you were a non-Muslim and you accepted Islam, then the tax that non-Muslims had to pay, if you accepted Islam, then it's waived and it's omitted. But the Umayyads were too greedy and they wanted money. And actually, at the end of Umayyad rule in 750, they were actually replaced by the Abbasids, another Muslim dynasty. Can you imagine? Just imagine this. Only 6% of the population of the Umayyad Empire were actually Muslims. So you had almost 90% who were non-Muslims. So you can imagine how that would have been a really lucrative and profitable income stream for them, with all the taxes from the non-Muslims. So whenever people converted, what's meant to happen theoretically is the tax is waived. It's called the jizya tax, the protection tax. The tax is waived, and now you can enjoy brotherhood with us. The Umayyads were too greedy, and they saw too much money coming in from the income tax, from the levy, and they said, right, even though you might accept Islam, we're still going to charge you for the tax. So you can imagine how that made the Berbers especially feel. We're treated as, the Byzantines treated us as subhumans. We accepted Islam to have a change of fortune, and it's pretty much the same thing happening here. So now a few contingents of Berbers started to revolt against the Umayyads. And this was whilst the Byzantines were still there, and they also started to ally themselves with the Byzantines again. So they were fluctuating. They had vacillating allegiances, just going from side to side like a pendulum. And at the end of it, the last stronghold of the Byzantines in North Africa was Carthage, which is in modern-day Morocco, if I'm not mistaken. Carthage. And one of Uqba ibn Nafi's successors, who was one of the ministers of North Africa, he set out with his army, and there was actually an Arab lady called Kahina. She was known as the priestess. So she'd actually taken charge of this Berber revolt. She'd allied herself with the Byzantines, and now they had made a final stand in Carthage, but luckily the commander Hassan ibn Nu'man managed to evict them. So now you've got Muslim rule. North Africa has fully been consolidated. So we're going to now just skip things and forward a little bit. So moving on now, this is after the Umayyads have fallen. Umayyads fell in 750. And as the Umayyads fell, Muslims, different dynasties started to pop up. The Umayyads aren't here anymore. The Umayyads ruled with an iron fist. Now the Abbasids came in. The Abbasids were a little bit softer. So they couldn't really hold on to some of the faraway lands that the Umayyads had managed to keep a hold of. For example, Spain. North Africa is a good example as well. So now people saw an opportunity. Some of these local Arabs saw an opportunity. You know what? Why don't we create our own independent states? So now you had 4 different dynasties which started to pop up after the Abbasids. 4 different dynasties. Let's just quickly run through them. Number 1, you've got this is North Africa, by the way. And the Abbasids didn't have control of any of those lands. So you had the Rustamids, first of all, and they were based in Algeria, and they took over, and they were completely antagonistic. They were hostile to the Abbasids. So now you've got your own Rustamid state based in Taharat, which is in modern-day Algeria. Then in southern Morocco, you had some Berbers as well, called the Banu Midrar. So Banu Midrar, they were a Berber dynasty, and they were led by somebody whose nickname was Midrar. And their base was a place called Sijil Massa. Sijil Massa. So now you've got another breakaway state. Then you've got the Idrisids, who are based in Fez. Fez, we've got our brother Idris here. Yeah, so Idrisids, who are based in Fez, which is modern day. Where's Fez? Anybody? In Morocco. Based in Morocco. So they actually created the city Fez. The city Fez didn't exist before them. They're the ones that inaugurated and established the city of Fez. Does anybody know why it's called Fez? I like that. No, the hats were called Fez because they came from Fez. The dyes, the crimson-colored dyes used for the Fezes came from the city of Fez. And the Ottomans popularized that. There's a whole backstory behind why the Fezes were even introduced. So, Fez comes from the Arabic word Fa'sun. Fa'sun means an axe. So when the Idrisids were digging the foundation for the new city, they came across an axe in the earth. Simple as that. Sounds a bit mundane and boring, but that's how the city bore its name. So Fez. And the Idrisids were actually Arabs. So the original founder, Idris I, he came from Arabia. And there was an uprising. The Shia had revolted against the Sunni Abbasids. The Abbasids defeated them near Mecca, actually, a fight near Mecca. So they were evicted. Now, where do we go now? Best place to go? Let's go to North Africa. I mean, it's open game now. It was like the Wild West. Anybody can just go and start their own state. Idrisis went there, and they started their own state as well. And Idris I, actually, he was killed by an Abbasid hit squad, by an Abbasid agent. And these Idrisids, they then built their state on refugees. So they welcomed people coming in from all different walks of life. You've got a bit of a metropolitan city going on here. So the first proper center of learning and culture and trade and civilization in North Africa was in Fez. So that's a fun fact to know as well. Now you've got the last out of the four states, which is, and they are probably the most important, called the Aghlabids. So there's an Arab commander as part of the Abbasids. He was sent there to keep the peace. And surprise, surprise, he saw an opportunity. So he thought, let me start my own state. His name was Ibrahim ibn al-Aghlab. Hence the name Aghlabids, the people who come from the progeny of Aghlab. And he took control for himself in the year 800 in Algeria. Yeah, so you can see there, you've got the Aghlabids with it's shaded in orange, in green, sorry, then you've got the brown lines. Now the reason why you've got those brown lines is because all those other three states, the Rustamids and the Idrisids and the Banu Midrar, they thought, we don't want anything to do with the Abbasids. Yeah, we're actually hostile to the Abbasids. The Aghlabids were different. The Aghlabids, they were actually subordinates to the Abbasids. So, can anybody name any Abbasid caliph? One of the most famous ones. And he's mentioned in Fada'il al-A'mal all the time as well. His stories come up all the time. Harun al-Rashid. Harun al-Rashid, really you could say, he epitomized the zenith and the apogee and the peak of the Abbasids, yeah, which was around about the 800s. And then Ibrahim ibn al-Aghlab comes along, and now he creates his own state. So, I mean, Harun al-Rashid, he's got no choice but to say, yeah, you can have your state, but in return, just give me a bit of money. So Ibrahim ibn al-Aghlab paid a yearly tribute of 40,000 gold coins to him for him to have his own state. So he still recognized the Abbasids are the caliphate, and the Abbasids are the overall rulers, and they're my overlords. I'm just their employee, if you want to put it like that. So the Aghlabids actually had a few problems, because remember, who did we say were the locals of North Africa? I'm going to keep on reiterating this point. The Berbers. Now, the Aghlabids were Arabs. And sometimes there was a bit of friction between the ruling class, the ruling aristocracy, the ruling class, with the Arabs, the old ruling class. They were seen as old style and antiquated and a little bit entrenched in their own traditions. Then you had the Berbers. And even some of the local Arabs started to side with the Berbers. And obviously, like all aristocrats, they were levying heavy taxes, and it was just sometimes it was getting a little bit too much for the population. So the population told the Maliki scholars in Tunisia, which is where the Aghlabids were based, why don't you start, not revolting, but now advising and giving counsel, and you could say, really speaking truth to power against the Aghlabids. So they started. And now people were starting to become angry, people were starting to, a revolt was close. So the Aghlabids, they thought, right, what we need to do is we need to win the favor of the Maliki scholars. And remember, the Maliki scholars have always been the legendary saviors of North Africa. Even when it comes to colonialism, in Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, in Libya, Umar al-Mukhtar, he was a Maliki. The person that we're going to discuss in a few weeks, he was a Maliki. So the Maliki scholars have always embodied this resistance within them. So the Aghlabids, they sought to buy the Maliki scholars and their loyalty. Obviously, it didn't work. So they thought of a new strategy. And this, I mean, you can resonate with this on every single level. They thought, to calm tension and turmoil and strife at home, let's divert attention to a foreign venture. Just that politicians do today. We've got so much problems in our own backyard. Let's just create another, maybe you could say, distraction outside, and then we can shift the attention and the blame away from us. So the Aghlabids, 823, They thought, you know what, we're going to now carry out a campaign in Sicily. We're going to carry out a campaign in Sicily and in Sardinia and in southern Italy. And at the helm, the commander of this army is going to be a Maliki scholar, Asad ibn Furat. So that campaign carried on and they were successful. So they were there for nearly 300 years. Muslims ruled Sicily for nearly 300 years. Again, under the European territory. So anyway, this is now the state of North Africa in, you could say, the 750s all the way up until the 900s. In 909, this all changes. Can anybody read what's written just above the key? The white box with the key inside. What's written on top? Beginning with an F. Fatimid. Fatimid. This is the new dynasty, up and coming, burgeoning dynasty. They were Shia. They were Shia and they hated the Abbasids' guts out. And they came along, just to cut the story short, they came along and somebody came along. Why are they called the Fatimids? One man came along called Ubaidullah. And he said, I am a descendant of, let's try and connect two and two here. Fatimid, I'm the descendant of Fatima radiallahu anha. If he is a descendant of Fatima radiallahu anha, which was a complete political ruse, by the way, he wasn't. That was just a political ploy to give himself some legitimacy so people think, wow, you've got a descendant of the Prophet. If you're a descendant of the Prophet, then automatically you have some prestige. You have some privilege in society. People look up to you as a leader. So he used this as a ruse to then gather and garner support against the Abbasids. And he said, the Abbasids, they're Sunnis. They're not worthy of being the caliphs. We are the caliphs. So he started his own rival caliphate. This was the first time ever in 909, the first time ever in Muslim history that two caliphates existed at the same time. Two rival, competing caliphates. And just a quick bit of legality, the second caliphate is always obsolete. The second caliphate is null and void, so it doesn't count as a caliphate because people have already pledged their allegiance to one. You can't have two caliphates, just like you can't have two gods, just like you can't have two head teachers, just like you can't have two prime ministers or presidents or kings. It doesn't work like that. Authority has to be absolute in the hands of one person or in the hands of one caliphate. So the Fatimids were deviants anyway. So they then swept across North Africa. They consumed the Idrisids. Idrisids no longer existed. Fatimids took over. The Aghlabids no longer existed. Fatimids took over. The Rustamids in Taharat no longer existed because the Fatimids took over. And they swept all the way until Egypt. And they captured Egypt from the Abbasids in the year 969. They were the ones who actually founded the famous city of Cairo. The Fatimids, they're the ones that established the city of Cairo. In Cairo today, there is a university, one of the most prestigious Islamic universities in the world. Al-Azhar University. Yeah? That's seen as a bastion and a stronghold of Sunnism and of traditional Islam. Now, what if I was to tell you, the Fatimids created Al-Azhar. The Fatimids created Al-Azhar as a mosque, firstly. Not just any old mosque, a center for their Shia propagation. Just like you have a Tablighi Markaz in Blackburn or Dewsbury, they had their Markaz in Cairo, which was the Al-Azhar Mosque. We're going to send out our missionaries and people to convey the Shia faith to all corners of the world from Al-Azhar University. Al-Azhar as we know it today. And it continued like that for nearly 300 years, all the way up until a certain individual of Kurdish origin came and dissolved the Fatimid state from within, and his name was Salahuddin al-Ayyubi. So can you see how things are connecting? Yeah, this is the beauty of history. I mean, you've all heard of Salahuddin. Now I've connected Salahuddin to the Fatimids. So you've got a bit of context. So he came and he converted Al-Azhar Mosque into now a university, a stronghold of Sunnism. So they were now completely destroyed. And look at what Salahuddin did here. Salahuddin, even before he took the fight to the Crusaders, he dealt with the Shia Fatimids first. Because political infighting within the Muslims is more detrimental. He said, how can I go and solve an external issue when the Muslims aren't united? So he had to get rid of the Fatimid Shias for the Muslims to now be considered as one homogeneous whole. Now we're ready to take the fight to the Crusaders. Only after he did that. And he prepared for nearly 20 years. Salahuddin prepared for nearly 20 years. So anyway, you've got the Fatimids here. And the Fatimids did some crazy things. The Fatimids, they had an eccentric figure called the Mad Caliph. And you've all heard of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, right, in Jerusalem, where Jesus in Christian law was reportedly crucified, and then they built a church on top of that location, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. So for whatever reason, the Shia, I'm going to put Caliph in inverted commas, he decided it would be a good idea to destroy the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. So you can understand how that led to some negative knock-on effects in the West. So that was actually one of the reasons why one of the more obscure, unknown reasons why the Western Europeans and the Catholics and the Latins wanted to even engage in the crusade in the first place. One of the reasons. Another reason, this is completely preposterous, and it just shows how the West will create all sorts of nonsensical propagandist ideas to fulfill their interests. So one of the outright lies, false lies, that the Pope Urban II, had actually invented and concocted was the Muslims, the Seljuk Muslims in Palestine, are slaughtering, butchering, cooking and eating Christians in Palestine. So because of that, we need to liberate our people. Completely false. But when you've got people and their only source of information is the higher-ups, and you could say the media like we have today, then that's the only narrative that they have. And if your head is a vacuum and it's filled in with one thing, then because you have no other opinions or no other narratives to fill your head with, that one idea will spread and diffuse across your entire mind, and you'll believe that to be the only idea. That's why there's a sort of a phrase, sort of a paradox, which is, would you rather read the news and be misinformed, or not read the news and be uninformed? Yeah, so now, I mean, it's a choice of the less of the two evils. We don't have to have any of those choices. We've got our own Muslim news outlets and media sources as well. You just have to find them online. So anyway, the Fatimids. The Fatimids were completely destroyed by Salahuddin from within. He caused an internal explosion, an implosion. Okay, now very quickly moving into, these are the indigenous Berber dynasties. Yeah? So we've got two of them. Number one, the Almoravids, and number two, the Almohads. So this was round about the time the Fatimids were still operating, just before. So we're talking about the early 1000s here. And just to very quickly sum up, Almoravid is actually a corruption of the Arabic word Al-Murabitun, which means those Muslims who inhabit a fortified monastery. And Almohad means Al-Muwahhidun, so the Unitarians, the people that believe in the ultimate oneness of Allah. And these were Berber dynasties. So now this is the first time in North African history you've got a local empire or dynasty run by the Berbers themselves. And very quickly, these two dynasties are important, the Almoravids and the Almohads. The Almoravids came first, and they were later replaced in a bloody coup by the Almohads. The Almoravids roughly early 1000s, and the Almohads early 1100s. Now, if you can see that map, the green demarcates Almoravid territory. Where does their territory end in the north? What's that in the north? Spain. So what happened was, just after the Umayyads crumbled in Spain, then you had a period of Spanish history, Muslim Spanish history, called Al-Muluk al-Tawaif, which means the petty kingdoms. No longer you have a central authority. So you had nearly 26 states. Imagine, small, tiny Spain, 26 Muslims. I'm going to have my own city. I'm going to have my own civilization. I'm going to have my own power. So they were all at each other's heads. And this was a complete nightmare for the Muslims. What do you think the Christians in the north were thinking? Now's the perfect opportunity for us to strike and carry out our reconquista, our reconquering of Spain. Why? Because the Muslims are disunited. When the Muslims are disunited, the enemies of Islam see a chink in the armor. That's our time to strike. So they started to strike. These petty kings in Spain, they were so petty, they would enlist the help of the northern Christians to fight against a fellow Muslim state just so that they could then engulf their own territory. But in the end, what happened? In the end, the Christians, they'd have an agreement. We'll enlist you and we'll send you to another Muslim state. The other Muslim state will be defeated by the Christians, and the Christians would annul the agreement they had with the other Muslims and now occupy that territory. The Muslims never learned. They carry on asking and petitioning for Christian help. And the Christians kept on backstabbing them. which just shows that if you compromise on your principles of Islam for any worldly or transient, temporal cause or reason, you lose out in both. You lose out in the world and you lose out in the hereafter. If you stick to your principles here, you might be seen as an outcast for a little bit. You might be then maybe alienated. You might be classed as an other. But in Allah's court, you'll be warmly embraced by Him. So that's something, very important principle you have to keep in mind. So now the Muslims in Spain were starting to shake and tremble in their boots. Why? Because the Christians from the north are advancing. So what do? Let's call the Almoravids. Let's call the Almorabitun Berbers from North Africa to help us. So they came twice actually. They checked the Christian advance from the north. So the Almoravids came the first time, stopped the incursion from the north, and then they went back. Then the petty kings, they relapsed. Imagine, they'd call for help, Almorabitun helped them out, and then the petty kings relapsed into their petty ventures amongst each other. So what do you think they did again when the Christians saw an opportunity? They called the Almorabitun once again. Almorabitun came now. Almorabitun came. This time, they had a fatwa with them. They had a legal ruling with them from none other than Imam Ghazali. And that was to legitimize Almorabitun conquest and campaigns in Spain. Because these petty kings are no good for the Muslims. So we're going to dissolve the petty kingdoms and you're all going to come under one central Almoravid rule. We have to reinstate Islam. That was their idea. Because you guys have strayed so far and deviated from the path of Islam, that's why you're being encroached upon from the north. So we're here to reinstate Islam. And surprise, surprise, guess what happened? The Almorabitun then fell into the same trappings and indulgences as the petty kings in Spain. So they fell into the same hole and ditch that the petty kings fell into as well. Then what do you think happened? The cycle repeated itself. Where the Almohads now, Al-Muwahhidun, Berbers, they saw the Almoravids. They saw them as irreligious. How can these people be the flag bearers of Islam? So we need to revolt and then take the mantle place and reinstate Islam. That's what the Almohads tried to do. And they carried that out in roughly the 1120s. And you can see there with the Almohad expansion. So they basically inherited the same territories as the Almoravids. And this is a very important principle. History is cyclical in nature, which means it keeps on repeating itself to an extent. So there was one very important, and I know I'm wary of time, so I'm just going to try and quickly gloss over this. There was one very important Muslim. He was a philosopher, he was a historian, he was a scholar. He is dubbed as the father of sociology, meaning the study of human societies and communities. Anybody know his name? I heard it from somewhere here. Ibn Khaldun. Ibn Khaldun, rahimahullah. Yeah? And I've heard speeches where Boris Johnson is quoting Ibn Khaldun. Joe Biden quotes him as well. Because in the West, if you want to study political philosophy in university, you can't graduate until you've read Ibn Khaldun. He was a Muslim. Ibn Khaldun said there's a cycle. There's a societal cycle when it comes to civilizations. And he calls this the lifespan, the natural lifespan of a civilization. He said it lasts for 3 generations. He based this hypothesis and theory on what happened with the Almoravids and the Almohads. He said, usually what happens is, first generation, and I want you to draw parallels between us here in the UK and this theory of Ibn Khaldun, because it really is insightful. He said, you've got generation number 1. They live in the deserts, they're Bedouin people, they are rugged, they're tough, they're principled, and they're simplistic in their way of life. And they see in a neighboring land or neighboring region a group of people who are stooped in their irreligiosity and their decadence. So they think it's about time that the new God comes in and replaces the old God. So the first generation moves in and now establishes themselves as the rulers. Generation number 1. Generation 2 comes along, the children of these initial conquerors. And even though they weren't born in the desert, and they're not really fully accustomed to desert life, they still have their parents. So the parents would teach them discipline and morals and ethics and chivalry and how to be a good human being and to be principled and be focused in life. Second generation. So they'd carry on. Then this second generation now starts to build the infrastructure and the architecture and the buildings and the welfare schemes and everything needed for a city and civilization to prosper. Then comes generation number 3. Generation number 3 are born in the palaces. Generation number 3 are born in the mansions. Generation number 3 are the pampered brats, if you want to call it that. And they are far removed from the early deserts of the first generation. They have no idea what it means to sacrifice. They have no idea what it means to be principled. They have no idea what a simple life is. They're too privileged. And they're too absorbed in their first world problems. And Ibn Khaldun says, when the third generation comes into power, that's when the decline starts. And then the cycle repeats itself with another group of desert people coming and taking their place. So think about our context here. I don't know if you have anybody from the first generation, but think about our grandfathers who came in the 50s and 60s and 70s. They were very simple. They came here with an idea, which is to earn money, but at the same time, we need to support our Muslims here. We're not short-sighted. We're going to be here for the foreseeable future. So let's build infrastructure and mosques and institutions and establishments to protect the religion of our future generations of posterity. They were principled and they were focused. And you can see them today. Just come to the mosque early, 10 minutes early, and the entire front row will be filled with these pioneers from the first generation. Then you've got the second generation. And I think we've got a few people from the second generation here as well. They now took up the mantle of the first generation. Now we've got the money, we've got the intellect, we've got the education. Let's start to build on what they did. So they carried on. They took us further. Then comes the third generation. And I'm ashamed to say this, I'm probably part of the third generation, where we're born into mosques like these. We're born into institutions where you've got Islamic universities on every single doorstep, you've got scholars in every single street, you've got memorizers of the Quran in their hundreds in localities, and we've lost the importance, we've lost touch with the simple, principled way of life of our ancestors. And I remember somebody saying, I forgot who it was, but he was saying, 20, 30 years ago, people were very simple. They'd come to the mosque, they'd listen to a lecture of the scholar, they'd be here 5 times a day punctually, and they'd respect the tradition, they'd respect Islam, and they'd carry out their lives in a very simple way. Now people are always questioning, people are challenging, people are objecting, and people are always posing questions against the faith. Posing questions isn't a bad thing if it's in search of the truth. If you're posing a question, if you're putting objections forward to try and, you could say, satiate or confirm these preconceived notions about Islam or against Islam, then that's problematic. And you can see how that's happening today, because we haven't had to go through, my generation, haven't had to go through any sort of hardship. I mean, go and ask your grandparents how they carried out their Hajj and how we carry out our Hajj today. Our Hajj today is like a 5-star package, and still we complain. For them, it was just take your tent with you, prop it up in the plain of Arafat or Mina, and there you go. You might not have a bath for days, you might not even have a bed to sleep on. But today, because we don't have AC in the room, we start complaining. Because we can't take a taxi from one place to another, we have to walk, then we start complaining as well. So this is the cycle of nations and empires proposed by Ibn Khaldun as his theory. So, al-muwahhidun al-murabitun, and then they come to an end as well. Then we've got, this is the last stage actually, this is second to last stage. So after the Almohads and Almoravids, you've got 3 different dynasties who then carried on with the Islamic tradition. You've got then in Morocco to the west, you've got the Marinids. In Algeria, you could say today, you had the Zayyanids. And to the east, in Tunisia, you had the Hafsids. And to be fair, if I want to sum up this period of history, and you can see at the top there, 13 to 14, they were all Berber dynasties. And by this time, there was only one bastion of Islam and stronghold of Islam left in Spain, which was the state of Granada. The state of Granada, which is in Spain, Granada, where you've got the Alhambra Palace, and you've got all the beautiful scenery and architecture. There's actually a phrase that there's actually a saying of the Spanish Muslims and non-Muslims in Spain, which is the worst affliction to suffer from in Spain, in Granada, is to be blind, because then you can't behold the marvels around you. So what was happening now was the Christians were pounding Granada, and the people in Granada were looking for help from these 3 dynasties. The people in Morocco, the Marinids, they tried to help to the best of their ability, but they were too weak to face off against now all of the Christians who were banding together in the north. They were no match. In the east, the Zayyanids and the Hafsids, they had actually come into alliances and peace treaties and agreements with the Christians. So they were being given troops and military support, by the Spanish Christians, and in return, the Muslims, the Hafsids and the Zayyanids, were to give free trade and trade concessions to Spanish merchants as well. So the Marinids weren't happy about this, obviously, because we're meant to be Muslims, we're meant to be sticking together against one common enemy. And here you're allying yourself with your enemy. So the Marinids started their incursion to the east. You know what, if you're not going to join us, then we'll just have to defeat you and then absorb you into our state as well. So it was largely uneventful for the Muslims. But for the Christians, they were capitalizing on all of these problems. Now we come to the big boy here. Now we come to the juggernaut, the superpower, known as the Ottomans. The Ottomans, they never really had control over any of the Arab lands up until 1517. That was when Selim I, Selim the Grim, as he's known as in the west, and Selim the Resolute, as he's known as Yavuz, in the eastern lands. He was the first one to start making his way east out of modern-day Turkey into Syria, Palestine, Lebanon, and Egypt. So he defeated another Shia dynasty called the Safavids from Iran, and then another Sunni dynasty in Egypt called anybody know, the Sunni dynasty in Egypt? The Mamluks in Egypt. And the Mamluks were actually housing and accommodating for one of the caliphs of Islam, one of the last remaining, or the last remaining Abbasid caliph. So now Selim takes over Egypt, and he's now holding the caliph prisoner. So what does he do? If he kills the caliph, I mean, that's a heinous crime. He won't be forgiven by the Muslims if he kills the caliph. And he was obviously a Muslim by himself. He was a religious Muslim as well, Selim. So these were the suggestions given by his advisors. Then somebody else said, why don't you just let the caliph go? But the problem is, if you let the caliph go, then that's a conflict of interest and power for yourself, because Selim saw himself as the greatest Muslim leader. You can't have two great Muslim leaders. So the suggestion that he undertook at the end was, you know what? I'll be the caliph. He's going to transfer caliphal authority to me, Al-Mutawakkil III, the Abbasid. He's going to transfer caliphal authority to me, and now I'm going to be the caliph of the entire Muslim lands and the sultan of the Ottoman domains. That all happened in 1517. So Arturul and Usman Ghazi and Orhan, they weren't caliphs. Usman Ghazi wasn't even a sultan. He was just what's known as a bey. He was just a tribal leader, a tribal chief. And sorry to burst a few people's bubbles here, but we have a dearth of information, very little information on Usman Ghazi. So just understand that the TV series Ertugrul is a romanticization and a fictional adaptation of history. I mean, it's good that it teaches certain principles and chivalry and camaraderie and whatnot, but from a purely historical point of view, it is severely lacking in actual facts. So just understand that. I mean, the problem now we have is people from the West watch all sorts of programs, but at least they know it's fiction. The problem is we're watching Ertugrul, we think it's fact, whereas it's not. It's just complete fiction. So at least just understand that as well. So now the Ottomans come into control here. And we're going to sum up here. North Africa came under Ottoman control, starting from one very important entreport. Entreport is a main port city in Algeria, called Algiers. Called Algiers. You can see it there, Algiers on the map. So that's the extent of Ottoman rule in North Africa. And Algiers was actually taken over by a heroic duo. Some of the most famous, I mean, in the West they call them pirates, but the proper term is a privateer. I'll explain what a privateer is. You just call him a pirate for now. One of the most, or the most famous, let's not use pirate, it's got negative connotations. One of the most, or the most famous and legendary and heroic Muslim sailor ever. Maybe after Muawiyah radiallahu anhu, because Muawiyah radiallahu anhu was the first naval admiral and commander of the Muslims ever. The first Muslim navy was inaugurated by Uthman radiallahu anhu, and the first naval officer was Muawiyah radiallahu anhu. So after Muawiyah, two brothers, Barbarossa brothers. The Barbarossa brothers, they've got a TV series as well. The Barbarossa brothers. And Barbarossa, which means crimson beard in Italian because they had red beards. So, two brothers, Uruk Barbarossa, and actually Barbarossa wasn't their name. Uruk and Khairuddin. So So Uruk and Khairuddin were actually from southern Greece. Their father was born there, and they were, you could say, sailors, and they started now disrupting Christian trade and Christian ships and merchantmen in the Mediterranean Sea. So they made their way to Algiers and in Algeria. Now we're talking about 1517. What happened before that in 1492? Something very important. Something which has never been, you could say, reinvigorated since. Fall of Granada, 1492. Muslims kicked out. Bye-bye Muslims, no longer in Spain. Imagine that, 1492. They were there for nearly 700 years. And they were now gone. Never ever to return. You go to Spain now, you find hundreds of Arabic loanwords in the Spanish language. You'll find so much Arabic culture and Islamic culture ingrained within Spanish culture, but they won't know where it's from. And there's actually systematic suppression of facts. Because the Spaniards today, the West, see it as a blot on their reputation. They see it as something filthy that we just have to rid ourselves of a Muslim past and a Muslim history. It's not really taught. I mean, in school, let's say for example, were you ever taught about the Ottoman history? Were you ever taught about Spanish history? Forget that. Were you even ever taught about British colonial history? Not in a million years. They will never ever teach you true British colonial history. The British were so bad in India, just a bit of a tangential point here, the Mughals were the emperors in India. They were the empire. I've got a series online on the greater Mughals as well. You can look that up there. Who was the most famous, most religious Mughal ruler ever? And he's the most maligned and disparaged today. Aurangzeb, Alamgir. During his time, the Indian economy, worldwide economy, surpassed China as the leading economy in the world. 24% of global GDP was concentrated in India. Imagine that, under the Muslims. And as soon as the British came, slowly but steadily, that started to decrease. When the British left in 1948, it had plummeted to 4%. Majority of the population were below the poverty line. They looted, they pillaged, they ransacked, and they siphoned resources, shipping them back off to England and to Britain. And you know what's even funnier? You know the word loot in English? It comes from India. So they went to India, they looted everything, and they thought, you know what, the last thing we can loot is the word loot, so they looted it. And they took it back to England. Winston Churchill as well. He's hailed and lionized as an ambassador of peace and humanity. Little known fact. The famine of Bengal was orchestrated by Winston Churchill, which killed off millions of people. Millions of people, the famine of Bengal. He siphoned the local resources and the staple food stock from Bengal, and he redirected it towards the West, towards Europe. And he said, we're more in need of it than they are, even though they were dying. He needed it for the war effort. When his officers, his British officers in Bengal, sent back damning reports, which were quite incriminating against the British government, they sent files and documents about British atrocities, which were started off by Winston Churchill. He was a racist. There's plain and simple terms. Winston Churchill was racist. And I'll tell you why. He said, when the reports came to him, from his own governors, from his own officers, British officers in Bengal, about what he'd instigated, meaning the famine, he said, when are these pesky rabbits going to die in Bengal? Rabbits meaning they keep breeding, so obviously how are they going to feed themselves if they keep creating children like that? Why don't they just breed themselves, or why don't they just cease breeding and just liquidate themselves? Self-liquidation, which is what he wanted. This is Winston Churchill. Somebody who's hailed as a hero of humanity. Not a hero of humanity, a hero of liberalism. The type of humanity that the West envisages. The West have their own idea of humanity. Islam has its own idea of humanity as well. So anyway, going back to the Ottomans with Barbarossa brothers. So they start to take over. Now Algiers is part of the Barbarossa brothers' new establishment. Now the Christians from the north are now starting to take over, especially the Spanish and the Portuguese. Algiers was before a Spanish port, you had Oran in Algiers, you had Tunis in Tunisia, you had Sella in Morocco. These were all Spanish ports. And the Spanish, They saw this as part of their reconquest. Meaning, we've taken over Spain, now we're not going to stop there, we're going to carry on and push forward, plow forward into North Africa. And that was a threat to the North Africans. So the Algiers, now the new government started by Khaldun Barbarossa, he saw it fit for him to ally himself with the Ottomans. And the Ottomans, it was a symbiotic relationship. It was mutually beneficial. Why? Because the Ottomans, now under their name, they've got one of their governors, Khaldun, ruling Algiers. And for Khaldun, he's now been given the prestige. He was the first ever Grand Admiral of the Ottoman fleet, Khaldun Barbarossa. Khaldun was his title given to him by the Ottomans. And now he's been given troops, he's been given these elite Janissary shock forces, he's been given money to now push back the Spaniards. And that's what he did over so many years until he eventually died. This now, remember, the backdrop of our story is in where? Algeria, in Algiers. So we'll probably just end off here at the North African history. We won't really go into the French occupation because I don't think we have time for that. But with now Algiers under the control of the Ottomans, they started to spread out. So we're talking about 1517, 1520. So by the end of that century, Tunisia was under Ottoman, what we call suzerainty, meaning control. So was Libya and now Algeria. Morocco, on the other hand, had different ideas. Morocco, at that time, they were ruled by a family called the Sa'dis, the Sa'di family. They were in charge for about 100 years, up until early 1600s, and they resisted Ottoman control. Remember, this is not Ottoman occupation. Language is so important. This is not Ottoman occupation. It's not Ottoman colonialism. It's not Ottoman imperialism. It's just an Ottoman takeover or control. Because language can shape narrative. I'll give you an example. Erdogan and Bashar al-Assad from Syria, Syrian president and the Turkish president, they had good relations up until, well, just before the Arab Springs in Syria. When the Arab Springs broke out in Syria, then the Turkish president gave his allegiance, he supported the revolutionary forces in Syria. So the civilian forces who'd now revolted against the government, the oppressive, tyrannical government. And surprise, surprise, who do you think propped up that government so many decades ago? The French. If you can remember from the last session, we talked about World War I. Remember World War I? So you had the Sykes-Picot Agreement. Let's carve up all of the Ottoman territories, dish it out between the British and the French when the Ottomans eventually lose in World War I. And the French were given Syria. So the French always had an ace in their deck. They always had a trick up their sleeves. It's like dead man's hand. So just before you die, I might as well take as many of them with me as I can. So when the French were eventually made to leave, they had already a contingency plan in mind. And they'd been working on that for so many years, which was to develop the progression of an uncivilized and backwards tribal people. And they were the Alawites in Syria, the family of Bashar al-Assad. They were nobodies. They were Shia as well. They were Shia. So they weren't mainstream Muslims as part of the Sunni tradition. So that was the ace in their deck. Why? Because when the French left, then they created an educated, intelligent, westernized, modernized class of Alawites. And they were then propped up as now the new government. The French knew very well what they were doing. The Alawites were a minority, less than 1%, less than 1% Shia, and the rest were all Sunni. They knew very well the tensions they were releasing. They very well knew the can of worms they'd now opened in Syria. So now you had the first al-Assad, Hafiz al-Assad, then you had Bashar al-Assad. So he comes from a long line of Alawites, propped up by the French. The French knew, if we can't have the land, then let's ensure that that land continues to suffer from infighting until we can regain it again. That's the type of ideology and mentality that the Western forces approach the Middle East with. That's not to say we blame everything on the West, what's happening in the Middle East, but they were instrumental in what's happening today. So now, Bashar didn't like that Erdogan was now siding with the revolutionary forces. So he did something which would hurt the Muslims and the Ottomans and the Turks as a whole more than fighting against him. You know what he did? He altered and changed the history textbooks of Syria from Ottoman control and from Ottoman rule in Syria to an Ottoman occupation. So you can see the connotations. The occupation is, we don't want you to be here, but you're forcing yourselves on them. That wasn't the case with the Ottomans. They were welcomed with open arms. I mean, they had to deal with a few problems internally, but they managed to placate them and calm them. So you can see how just the change of one term can eschew and doctor and really then distort an entire legacy of history with the Ottomans. And the Ottomans carried out wonders for the Arab nations. So anyway, this was an Ottoman occupation in Algeria. It was Ottoman rule and Ottoman control. So now we have what's called the Regency of Algiers. Yeah, and we're about to come to an end with our, we're about to set the scene to the French occupation. The Regency of Algiers. Regency means the main ruler is either absent, or he's young, or he's incapacitated, so somebody else takes the reins on his behalf. So Khairuddin Barbarossa, he was the first governor of Algiers. Why? Because look how far Algiers is from Constantinople. So it was difficult for the Ottoman Sultan at that time, Sultan Selim, and then his son Suleiman the Magnificent, to administer direct control over Algiers. So why not have one of our subordinates, one of our governors there, leading? And he has his independence and autonomy. Do what you like, as long as you, two things in Muslim history, which is a principle. If you do these two things, then you're, as a ruler, as a dynasty, as a state, then you're seen as an ally to the ultimate caliphal authority. You're seen as subordinates and subjects, and you're not seen as rebels trying to vie against the caliph. Two things. Number one is, you as a leader, in your Friday sermons, you mention the caliph, and you extol the caliph, and you commend the caliph. Which is why sometimes, it's always baffling to me sometimes when you go to some places and the brother doesn't understand, the one who's leading the sermon, he doesn't understand what he's reading from the default Arabic sermon. So you've got a few passages in there saying, may Allah preserve the caliph, may Allah then uplift the caliph, and may Allah do such and such a thing to the caliph. And I'm there scratching my head thinking, what caliph are you talking about? I don't know what caliphate we have operational today. But that was why the Jumu'ah sermon was important, because it reinforced the political authority of the caliphate. If you do that, then at least the king or the caliph would know that you're his subordinate. And number two is, any coins that you mint, you have to mint it with the commemoration of the caliph. So you have to say, you can say maybe such and such a sultan of such and such a region mints a coin with the approval of the caliph. So at least the caliph knows you're on his side. The Moroccans didn't do that. The Moroccans, they wanted their own governance, and then in the 1600s they had their own Alawite, different from the Syrian Alawites, their own Alawite dynasty, sovereignty actually, which lasts up until today in Morocco. So anyway, the Regency in Algiers, and what that did was to Algiers was it transformed this town of Algiers from just a backwater port into now a very important headquarters and a capital town for the Ottomans in North Africa. And from there, the Ottomans sent out troops to bring Tunisia under control and Libya under control, and then to the southern regions of Algeria as well. And from Algiers, that's where the Ottoman naval squadrons and fleets carried out their jihad against the Spanish and the Portuguese. And they really, really terrorized and harassed the Spanish and Portuguese fleets and trading vessels in the Mediterranean. This is now where we lead up to the final point, the final section of our North African history, known as the Barbary States, or the Barbary Coast. Barbary coming from the word? Barbarian. Barbarian. So this again is an exonym. It's a name given by outside forces. So the Westerners called this North African, you could say, crescent or coast as the Barbary States. Barbary States meaning they were barbaric. Why? Because all of these main ports had taken up jihad against the Spanish and the Portuguese. And the main way they carried out jihad was by harassing fleets and by launching raids and incursions onto the Spanish Mediterranean coast. And this jihad was actually spearheaded by what the Westerners like to call pirates. But in proper terms, in academic terms, not a pirate, a privateer. Because there's a difference between a pirate and a privateer. Non-Muslim sources will label Khairuddin Barbarossa and his brother Uruk Barbarossa as pirates. Now the first thing that comes to your mind with pirates is Captain Jack Sparrow. Pirates of the Caribbean. Swashbuckling pirates, lawless, fugitives. They are relentless, they're barbarians. That's the type of idea. Again, shows why language is so important. They weren't pirates, they were privateers. A privateer is a seafarer, a sailor, who's commissioned by a state to then intercept and raid ships of a nation they're at war with. So the Ottomans gave Khairuddin and the Barbary states permission to raid Christian ships. And the Ottomans were at war with the Spanish and Portuguese Christians. They would raid the ships, and then a certain fraction of the loot would go back to the Ottoman Sultan, a certain fraction of the loot would go back to the Regency of Algiers, and then the rest of it could be distributed and divided amongst the sailors and the captain as well. So during the Ottoman rule, these Mediterranean states were known as the Barbary states and the Barbary coast. And that was their main source of income through, if you want to call it, piracy or privateering. And the main ports were, we'll just mention them now, Algiers, Tunis, Tripoli, which is in Libya, and Salla. And now, this is actually really interesting. Jack Sparrow, Pirates of the Caribbean, he was actually based upon a model by a real man called John Ward. So Jack Sparrow is it's obviously fiction, but he's based off a man called John Ward, who was an English privateer or a pirate. And his nickname was Sparrow, John Ward. His nickname was Sparrow. That's why Captain Jack Sparrow is known as Jack Sparrow. And what happened is, in 1588, something happened. We're going to end on this. 1588. Completely detached from the Muslim world, something was happening. Or something did happen. British and the Spaniards. The British defeated the Spanish Armada. Yeah, if you can remember from, this is the stuff that you're taught in history textbook that just flies over your head, but it's important. I'll connect it to why it's important here. So the British were at war against the Spanish, and they defeated the Spanish Armada in 1588 in the British Isles. So now this is when Queen Elizabeth of England now issued what's called a letter of marque, which is all pirates and privateers have now commission from the state, from the crown, to now start intercepting and raiding Spanish ships. Because obviously they're at war with each other, and the prisoners were to be taken as slaves. John Ward saw an opportunity, and he started raiding. And all these British privateers had now a lucrative market in front of them. In 1604, the British and the Spanish now conducted a treaty. So no more fighting. No more fighting means, what does it mean for the privateers? Out of business. Unemployed now. So what do? Where do they go? Where do they go? To the Barbary states. So this John Ward, we're going to call him Jack Sparrow, went to the Barbary states, and he was based in Tunis. He had a mansion in Tunis. And the Ottoman Dey, known as the Ottoman regional governor, actually had a really good relationship, friendly relationship with John Ward. And he said, you know what? You carry out your privateering and piracy against the Spanish, and we'll give you land in Tunisia. This is John Ward. This is the inspiration for Captain Jack Sparrow. So John Ward carried out his piracy, and he amassed huge treasures. He actually became a Muslim as well. So Jack Sparrow is a Muslim. Yeah, so John Ward accepted Islam later on in his life. I mean, he carried on drinking and he carried on in his un-Islamic ways, but that's the story behind it. So after the treaty between the British and the French, these privateers in Europe thought, you know what, out of business, let's migrate to the Barbary states. So now it's filled with British and Dutch fearless raiders of the waves. So they set up camp there. And this carried on all the way up until maybe late 1700s. So this carried on. And the Ottomans, they had their influence. I mean, it was back and forth with the tribes, and the Ottomans knew, look, tribal people, they're a bit unruly, will control the main cities, and then, we'll employ the tribal chiefs to keep the order in the hinterlands and in the desert lands as well. That all changed. That all changed in 1789. Something happened in 1789, which we're going to conclude on today, and we'll pick up maybe not next week, the week after next week. And hopefully we can try and wrap things up. Anybody know what happened in 1789 in Europe? Richard, uncle? The French Revolution. So up until then, France had been a monarchy. You've got a king. The Bourbon monarchy. And the French did not like it because obviously monarchs, not by definition, but characteristically, they're oppressive. They extort the people. They levy exorbitant taxes. So people don't like them. So there was a revolution, and now the French wanted to have their own republic. Meaning we want a system with representatives, and we want to start electing people. We don't want a monarchy. This is where we're going to leave here. Because one of what's called the casus belli, which means the reason for war, one of the main reasons, and it's really funny actually, it's comical, it's satirical. One of the reasons why the French, or the reason they like to portray, I mean, you had sinister underpinnings to the French invasion, but this is what's really put out in history textbooks. Something happened between the Ottoman Dey. The Dey is in Algiers. He's the regional governor in Algiers, who's appointed by the military troops in Algeria, the Turkish military troops, Ottoman troops, and he's now the leader of Algeria. In 1827, something happened between him and a French consul. Maybe I'll just give it to you now and then we'll talk about it later on. So, 1789, French Revolution. And who was the most important figure afterwards of the French Revolution? The new French Empire, which spawned out of the French Revolution. I mean, everybody has to know this name. Napoleon. Napoleon Bonaparte. So he carried out his expansion. And he later on became the emperor as well, Napoleon. He conquered Egypt. He conquered Egypt, and he inflicted, Napoleon, one of the most humiliating defeats on the Ottomans ever. The Ottomans suffered one of the most humiliating defeats at the hands of Napoleon in Syria. Syria, modern day Palestine, actually. He had around less than 500 troops with him, Napoleon. 30,000 on the opposite side. The opposition, Turkish, they weren't Turkish, they were allied to the Ottomans. So let's just say Ottoman troops. They lost thousands. Napoleon's army lost two soldiers. That was a humiliating defeat because now it showed that the Ottomans were now succumbing and crumbling to European pressure. So now the Ottoman Sultan needed to change. That's a whole different story in and of itself. So now Napoleon is going on full force with his wars and his Napoleonic campaigns. Now, if you've got a campaign going on, and you've got huge ambitions, what do you need? You need a military force, right? Now, are military soldiers robots? Are they drones? What do they need to be sustained? They need food. They need provisions. So where do you get these provisions from? I mean, you can't just redirect all of the French provisions from France itself to the soldiers. What about the French people? They need something. So they looked towards Algeria. And Algeria was one of the world's leading exporters in wheat. Obviously, wheat, you get bread. So the French Empire, or the French Republic, they approached some very influential Algerian Jewish families, two actually, and said, right, you're going to supply us with wheat, and we'll obviously give you the money. So the Jewish tribes, in turn, and just a side point, the Jews, the Christians, and the Muslims lived with relative cohesion and coexistence in the Ottoman lands, as opposed to in the West. In the West, if you were a Jew, then consider your life a misery. And there's actually an interesting book which posits that anti-Semitism came from Europe, came from Christian Europe. People think that anti-Semitism is a Muslim enterprise today. Muslims invented it, and the Quran is anti-Semitic. Anti-Semitism came from the Christians in Europe. There's a funny story that comes to mind, but I don't think we've got time for that. So now the Jews in Algiers approach. His name was Uthman Dey. Uthman Dey. He was the Dey, the regional governor in Algiers, and he said, "Okay, we'll provide you with the wheat. We'll provide the Jews with the wheat. Then the Jews have to provide the state with money, and the Jews were then meant to accrue the money from the French." Now the French were going through their own turmoil, and to be fair, the French never really had any intentions of paying off this debt. So they carried on purchasing wheat on credit, and in 1827 they'd amassed an arrears of nearly 8 million francs. So huge amounts, crazy amounts of money. So Uthman Day was getting a bit restless now. So he said to the Jewish tribes, go to the French and we want the money back. And the French had no intention of paying it back. So the French, to try and calm down Uthman Day, they sent one of their consuls. His name was Pierre Deval. He sent one of their consuls to Algiers to talk it out with Uthman Day. So Uthman Day, obviously, he was irritated, he was annoyed. I've actually got a picture here as well. Yeah, so that's Uthman Day on the left. Uthman Day, you can obviously tell by the clothing he's wearing. So Uthman Day, he was so infuriated that he struck Pierre Deval with his fly swat. He gave him a good slap with his fly swat. And the French were so insulted and enraged by this that it set off a chain of events which eventually led up to the invasion of Algeria. Just because Uthman Day, he smited Pierre Deval, the French consul. So that's, you could say, the apparent cause of war, but there were more sinister undertones, which we'll hopefully look at in the coming weeks, and we'll end it there. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He inspires us with true knowledge, and I again obviously apologize that we've gone over time, but I hope it was interesting. And obviously because we do have the YouTube live feed set up as well, so these slides will be on there as well. Anything you might need to recap will all be on the YouTube video. So we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that He gives us true understanding of knowledge, and at least you should have a bit of a chronology. You got the Arab conquest, and then you had the Berber revolt, then you had the Idrisis, Aghlabids, they combated Abbasid authority except for the Aghlabids, then you had the Almoravids, Almohads going into Spain, then the cycle that Ibn Khaldun talks about, then you had the Fatimids before that, then you had the three different Marinids, and then the Zayyanids, the Hafsids. They were fighting amongst each other because they couldn't agree on one unified strategy against the Spanish and the Portuguese. And then you had the Ottomans, and now we leave off with the French occupation. Ameen wa akhiru da'wana alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen.
Because on the YouTube you actually can't see the slides.